What's going on, everybody? This is Johnny Brook, and welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. So this week's project is a pretty special one, as it's the first real project I'm building here in my newly renovated shop space. So this project is a workbench based around this lift top table I got almost 2 years ago now, and needless to say, I've been extremely excited ever since to finally get this thing into service. I started the project by breaking down some plywood, and the plywood I'm using on this project is a Arauco Ply Radiata Pine plywood. And Arauco is the sponsor of this week's video, and we'll talk more about why I chose this Arauco Ply plywood later in the video. After using my track saw to cut the panel to length, I ripped the panel into strips at the table saw. And these 11-inch wide strips will make up the sides and dividers in the torsion box section of the workbench. I ripped the first strip a little wider than 11 inches so I could then rip off the factory edge to give myself a nice clean edge, which will lead to a stronger glue bond than the factory edge. Next, I needed to cross-cut some of the strips to get the short sides and the shorter dividers, and I did this with my miter saw. And I know I say this a lot, but I absolutely love having a stop block set up on my miter saw. It makes these kinds of repeatable cuts go super quick and the pieces end up more accurate. So one of the keys to a successful torsion box assembly is making sure the assembly is flat during the glue up. And when thinking about the flattest surfaces in my shop, my mind immediately went to my CNC spoil board, which I know is perfectly flat. The only problem was my CNC was partially disassembled from moving it out of my old shop, and it hadn't been set up, leveled, or flattened here in the new shop. So I started the process of getting things put back together, starting by giving the CNC a good cleaning. Next, I ran all the cables to the electronics box, having to double check my old video on setting up my CNC to make sure things were put back together correctly. With that done, I could jog the machine for the first time in the new shop, and as you might have seen in my shop tour, I was really worried about some of the rust that had formed on the linear rails and the rack and pinion drive system. Whoa, whoops. And everything seemed to run smoothly apart from a little crackling during that initial jogging, and I just made sure to add fresh grease to the linear bearing pillow blocks before the initial jogging. So next I could move on to getting the machine leveled and squared. I used a line laser to help level the base, which makes the process really simple, and then I could get my vacuum table set back up. And I have an entire video on how I initially set this whole system up, but thankfully I didn't glue any of the parts together at my old shop, so I could easily put everything back together here in the new shop. I also went ahead and got my dust collection for the CNC setup, as I'd be generating plenty of dust when flattening the spoil board, and I used the same Rockler ceiling track system to hang the dust hose above the gantry. And this worked great in my old shop, and the only challenge here in the new shop was dealing with the drop ceiling. Next, I could get the gantry squared up, and to do this, I cut a series of 4 holes with the machine, and then measured the diagonals between those holes to check for square. The gantry was slightly out of square, so I adjusted the Y-axis sensors, and reran the program, repeating the process until the machine was cutting nice and square. The last thing to do before the CNC was operational was to tram the spindle, which ensures the spindle itself is square to the spoil board. Once again, the spindle was slightly out of tram, which is kind of inevitable when moving a CNC like I had to, but thankfully the spindle on this Avid CNC is very easy to tram with the built-in tramming plate. Once that was done, I could flatten the spoil board, and I always seem to go a little overboard with this, taking off too little on the first few passes, then getting impatient and taking off way too much. And as you can see, even with dust collection, this is a majorly dusty process, but thankfully it's not a process that has to be done very frequently. With that, the CNC was ready for action, and I figured why not give it a bit of a shakedown on this workbench project, starting by using it to cut the holes in the sides of the torsion box. And these holes will house the drawers in the workbench, and obviously I could have cut these a bunch of different ways, with router templates, cutting up the sides and gluing them back together, face frame style, etc., but the CNC definitely made this super simple. Once the first side was cut, I turned off the vacuum table so I could swap the sides, and everything looked great. And I also added these dog bone fillets to the corners so my drawer slides could sit tight into these corners, as otherwise they would have been rounded. I swapped the sides using these slots and a few dominoes to locate the piece, and as you can see, I also had a little mishap with the CNC, leaving a little scar on one of the sides. Thankfully, this was on the inside face, so it won't be seen in the finished project, but you can definitely ruin a lot of parts in a hurry on the CNC if you're not careful. I re-zeroed the bit, ran the program, and then the two sides were done. Next, I loaded up a full sheet and cut out the bottom panel, and I obviously could have done this with the table saw and track saw, and it honestly would have been easier, but I wanted to use this larger cut to double check the machine for square, which thankfully it was. With that done, all the parts for the torsion box were cut, so now I could move on to assembly. I considered a bunch of options for joinery here, and if I had thought I'd build the entire project on the CNC, I could have gotten pretty crazy with the joinery, but I ended up keeping it pretty simple and just used pocket holes and glue. I drilled pocket holes into the dividers and sides along both the bottom and top edges, and I used my Craig Foreman for this, but a standard pocket hole jig would have worked just as well. Once that was done, I could start assembling the torsion box, and this is why I got the CNC all dialed in, as assembling this on the CNC spoil board ensured I ended up with a pretty much dead flat torsion box. I used the vacuum table to clamp the bottom panel flat to the spoil board, and then I could just assemble the sides on top of the bottom panel, initially tacking them in place with brad nails, and then adding the pocket screws on the inside of the torsion box. After attaching the long sides to one short side, I added the long center divider, and I cut a spacer from a scrap piece of plywood to make locating this divider really simple. Next, I can install the shorter dividers, which make up the majority of the torsion box, and also created each drawer bay. And while I'm working, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Arauco, and their beautiful sanded plywood I used on this project. So this Arauco plywood is made from ethically sourced radiata pine, which is grown in Arauco's sustainably managed certified forests. The plywood is AC grade, meaning it has one clear, smooth face, making it perfect for the exterior faces of cabinets or furniture projects. Because the Arauco ply's face veneers are peeled from pruned logs, they have substantially less knots than other comparable plywood. These 23/32 of an inch panels I used feature a 7-ply construction, which means the panels are extremely stable and the cores have a minimal amount of voids. The A face is already sanded to 150 grit, so it's basically ready for finish right from the factory, and this pine accepts a variety of finishes. So if you're looking for a durable, beautiful plywood for your next project, click the link in my video description to learn more about Arauco ply and find a distributor near you. Thanks again to Arauco for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to the project. With that, the torsion box skeleton was done, so I removed the bottom panel, flipped over the torsion box, and then added plenty of glue to the bottom edges of the torsion box. And I made sure to spread the glue out, so I ended up with a really good glue bond between the bottom panel and the skeleton, since this glue bond makes up most of the strength of a torsion box and is what keeps the whole thing flat over time. I dropped on the bottom panel, tacked it at each corner to square up the skeleton, and then marked lines where the dividers were located. I then hopped on top of the assembly and proceeded to go to town stapling the bottom of the skeleton with narrow crown staples, using my massive body weight to make sure the whole thing stayed mostly flat during the assembly process. Finally, I could flip the whole assembly over, turn on the vacuum table to suck the whole thing flat to the spoil board, and then I added all of the pocket screws to really lock everything together. And I left the vacuum table running for about 30 minutes to let the glue set up a bit, and it seemed to stay super flat even after turning off the vacuum, which is great. Next, I needed to work on the workbench top, so I moved the torsion box out of the way with this Rockler Material Mate cart and set it on my current assembly table for the time being. So the top is made up of 2 sheets of 3/4 inch Arauco ply laminated together. So I got another sheet of plywood loaded up on the CNC and spread on a bunch of glue using this very handy Rockler glue roller. I got a second sheet of plywood dropped on top of the first piece, not without a little struggling. And then I could turn on the vacuum table and once again go to town with nails to attach the pieces together. This time though, I used this really cool composite nailer, so I didn't need to worry about where my nails ended up. Because these nails are made of plastic, you can cut right through the nails without damaging router bits or blades. The next day, I noticed that a number of these nails had left a little extra material above the surface of the plywood, so I went around with a scraper and scraped off these bits so they didn't protrude. Once that was done, I flipped the piece over so the top surface was facing up, and then I could start cutting the features into the top. So I started with this point roundover bit, which I've never used before, but basically this bit allows you to easily add a roundover using the CNC. Unfortunately, I had to manually zero the X and Y axes because the curved edges of the bit wouldn't work with my corner finding touch plate, but otherwise the bit worked great. I did accidentally load the wrong program, loading the file for the profile cut rather than the roundover, and this definitely did some damage, but thankfully I had some extra length on the sheet, so I could just shift everything back a few inches and rerun everything. I ran the initial roundover pass with a pretty conservative depth setting as I didn't want to go too deep and end up with a ridge, and I honestly probably could have just left it at that, but I wanted to figure out what depth worked with this bit for future projects, and for this 1/4 inch radius bit, a depth of about 0.24 seemed to work well. Next, I loaded up my 3/8 inch compression bit to cut the profile and zeroed the bit out, but in retrospect, I shouldn't have zeroed the X and Y axes here since I already had those manually dialed in with the roundover bit. And this resulted in a slight offset between the roundover and profile cut, but again, this workbench was more of a learning project, so it really didn't matter too much. The same compression bit also cut the grooves for the T-track in the top surface after running the roundover and cutting the profile, since that reduced the chip out I would have ended up with otherwise. And I've cut these T-track grooves with a handheld router plenty of times in the past, and that works fine, but the CNC definitely makes it easier. After the initial pass, the grooves were a little too tight, so I added 2/100ths to the pocket in Vectric Aspire, the software I use to create all of these cutting files. Unfortunately, I didn't consider that this would add 2/100ths to each side of the pocket, essentially doubling that number, and this resulted in a slightly loose final fit with the T-track, and this isn't a huge deal, but it's definitely something I want to keep in mind in the future. While the CNC worked, I started cleaning up the torsion box, first planing down some areas where the bottom panel was slightly proud of the side panels. And even though I have tons of power tools, there's still something just so satisfying about pulling out some hand tools. Next, I went ahead and sanded the sides to remove any glue squeeze out and clean things up, and I decided to try a new to me sandpaper on this project, made by Legit Grit. And overall, this sandpaper worked great, and it's a lot cheaper than most of the other sandpaper options I typically use, plus it's available in a bunch of different hole patterns to fit all the different sander brands that I own. And I've got a link in the video description to a pack of Legit Grit sandpaper with the grits I personally use in case you want to check it out, and let me know what you think if you decide to try it out. I continued sanding until the CNC finished up, and once it was done, I flipped the top over to run the last CNC operation, which cut some grooves on the underside of the top to match the torsion box. And I made these grooves oversized by about 1/4 inch in each direction, and I mainly added these so I knew where to add glue when I go to attach the torsion box to the top later. While the CNC worked, I turned back to the torsion box and could start getting the drawer hardware installed. I used these new centerline undermount drawer slides from Rockler here, and because of the way this torsion box was assembled, I needed to use these brackets, which are typically used when installing these slides in face frame cabinets, to hold the back end of the drawer slides. I added some scrap pieces of plywood to act as blocking to fill out the space where the brackets needed to mount, and I attached those pieces with glue and narrow crown staples. To install the drawer slides, I originally used this Rockler undermount drawer slide jig, but this is designed to work with Bloom undermount slides, and the jig didn't really work that great with these slides, since the slides need to be inset further than Bloom slides. I also struggled to get the brackets set to the right height, but came up with a much better solution for this, which I'll show a little later. Once the slides were installed, I confirmed my drawer box measurements, and then I could start batching out the 10 drawers I needed for this workbench. These drawers are made of 1/2 inch sides and 1/4 inch bottoms, just like the other undermount drawers I've made on this channel. And of course, the 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch sheets of Arauco ply were buried at the bottom of this stack. I started by breaking a sheet of 1/2 inch plywood down into 18 inch sections, which would make up the drawer sides, and I once again ripped the first section wider than needed so I could cut off that factory edge. Once the sections were cross-cut, I ripped the pieces to their final size, and I had laid all of this out using the Cutless plugin in SketchUp to make sure I used the plywood efficiently. And I should mention that I do have plans available for this torsion box workbench in case you're interested in building something similar, and I've even designed a simple base to go with the top in case you don't want to spring for a lift top table like I'm using. And I'll link to the plans in the video description in case you're interested. After breaking down the rest of the drawer box parts, I needed to cut a groove in the sides to house the 1/4 inch bottom panel. To do this, I used this new blade, which I picked up on the recommendation of my buddy Mike Farrington, who also inspired this whole project. And this blade is designed to cut box joints, but it just so happens to be exactly 1/4 inch wide, making it perfect for cutting these grooves. After getting it installed, I set the blade height to 1/4 inch using these Rockler setup blocks, and then set the fence 1/2 inch from the inside of the blade, since the drawer bottom needs to be inset 1/2 inch from the bottom edge of the drawer to work with these undermount slides. I made the cut, double-checked the measurements, and everything looked good, so I went ahead and cut the grooves on the inside faces of the rest of the drawer box pieces. Next, I needed to notch out the bottom corners on the back pieces to accept the undermount slides, and I did this over at the bandsaw. And all of these dimensions are clearly outlined in the instructions that Rockler provides, and this process is very similar to other undermount slides I've installed in the past. Once that was done, I headed back over to the table saw and got the bottom panels cut to size from a sheet of 1/4 inch plywood. And with that done, the drawer boxes were ready for assembly, and I initially used glue and narrow crown staples here, but the narrow crown stapler was a little unwieldy, so I ended up switching to pin nails later on. Also, as you can see, the bottom panel was extremely tight in these grooves, a little too tight really, so I sanded the rest of the panels before assembly, which made them fit much better. Once the first box was assembled, I needed to get it prepped for installation, starting by drilling a pair of holes in the back of the drawer box. And these holes accept the locking hooks that are built into the drawer slides, which you'll see later. Next, I got the clips installed on the bottom front edge of the drawer, and these install a little differently than the Bloom clips I'm used to using, but they were still pretty straightforward. With the clips installed, I attempted to install the drawer, but due to some misalignment during the drawer slide installation, I had a pretty tough time of it, and it did end up fitting, but I changed my process when installing the rest of the slides. First, I used this spacer below the back bracket to make sure the drawer slides were level, and second, I measured the space between the slides and the sides of the cabinet and made sure they were equal rather than relying on the undermount jig to square the slides. And doing these two things led to drawers that fit great, and after installing all the hardware, I immediately removed the slides so I could get the torsion box attached to the top. And I figured installing the slides before the top was on would be easier, and I think it definitely was, but the slides would have been in the way when I went to add the pocket screws to attach the top, so they needed to be temporarily removed. To install the top, I first added glue to those grooves I had routed in, making sure to spread it evenly so I ended up with a really good glue bond, and then I dropped the torsion box into the grooves and turned on the vacuum table to make sure the top was nice and flat while I attached the torsion box. And these definitely weren't the easiest pocket hole screws to install, but thankfully I made this torsion box tall enough for this to work, and I also used a shorter driver bit to make this a little easier. After installing all the screws, I once again left the vacuum table running for probably a good hour to let the glue set up, and while I waited, I went ahead and drilled some mounting holes in the lift top table. And the steel on this table was pretty darn thick, but the combination of an 1/8 inch bit to start the hole and then a step bit to enlarge the hole made pretty quick work of things. I drilled a hole at each of the 4 corners, and once that was done, I was finally ready to mount the workbench to the lift table. I got the workbench moved into place and centered on the lift table, and then drilled a hole up through the hole in the lift table, dropped in a carriage bolt, and snugged it down with a wrench. I repeated the process for the other holes, and once the workbench was attached, I could try out the lift table, and thankfully, it works awesome. At its lowest, it'll drop to about 24 inches, which should be perfect for working on taller items, and at its highest, it'll get to well over 5 feet, which is way higher than I really need. I went ahead and got all the drawers reinstalled, and then I could hop on and test the workbench out under load. And of course, the lift table had no problem since it's rated at 1,000 kilograms. Next, I can go ahead and get some finish applied to the bench, but first I sanded everything with 150 grit sandpaper. After sanding, I got my HVLP gun loaded up with my shop clear coat of choice, Total Boats Halcyon Clear. And as you can see, a can of black paint busted open during the move, hence all of the crud on the bag, but thankfully the Halcyon was unscathed. And I decided to try spraying Halcyon without thinning it for some reason, and this went very poorly. So I ended up opening the flow rate on the gun up so much that the threaded end popped off, along with the spring that holds the needle in place, which I unfortunately did not notice, and this led to streams of halcyon squirting out of the gun uncontrollably. After a few minutes of cursing, I moved up to a larger needle size, thinned the halcyon by about 20% with water, since it's a water-based finish, and ended up with a much better result. I also cleaned up the excess halcyon with a foam brush, and thankfully this stuff self-levels pretty well, and also this was only the first coat. For the drawer fronts, which I hadn't actually cut to size yet, I decided to add a little pop of color. I've had this half of a bag of Total Boats Elixir paint in this Whaler blue color hanging around and figured it would be a fun choice for the drawer fronts, so I rolled on a coat and let both the clear coat and paint dry overnight. After drying, the paint had absorbed into the wood and really accentuated the grain pattern, which I think looks pretty cool. Next, I could go ahead and cut the drawer fronts to size at the table saw and miter saw, and I ended up with a mix of painted and unpainted drawer fronts due to some bad math on my part. Also, I think pre-painting pieces like this and then cutting them to size gives you the sharpest lines if you only want paint on the face of the piece. You just need to make sure to use a high tooth count blade so you don't end up with a bunch of chip out. Once the pieces were cut to size, I chamfered the edges with a combination of a block plane and some hand sanding. And I was worried a router would lead to chip out and potentially scratch those painted faces. Plus, is there anything more satisfying than chamfering edges with a block plane? I don't think so. Next, I needed to get the drawer fronts mounted, and I figured the easiest way to do this would be to add a straight edge that all of the drawer fronts could sit on while being installed. And I figured out where I wanted the straight edge, marked some lines, and then clamped an offcut in place, and this ended up being pretty simple and led to perfectly aligned drawer fronts, as you'll see. So I decided to try a trick I picked up from Mark Spagnolo, aka the Wood Whisperer, to install these drawer fronts, and the first step in this process was to drill holes where your drawer pulls will mount. I measured this location out on one drawer front, drilled the holes, and then transferred those points to the rest of the drawer fronts using a center punch. Next, I drilled all the holes over at the drill press, setting my drill press fence to help make alignment a little easier. With that done, I made marks at each drawer opening corresponding to the edge of the drawer fronts, and then I could align one of the pieces with that mark. And here's where the trick comes in. So I drove in 2 temporary screws through the holes for the drawer pulls, locking the drawer front in place. And after repeating the process on the rest of the drawer fronts, I first conveniently lowered the lift top table to make it a little easier to work, and then pre-drilled holes for mounting screws from the inside of the drawer. To mount these kinds of drawer fronts, I typically use these 1-inch long screws, which have an oversized head, so you could drill larger holes if you needed more adjustability. Even if you don't need adjustability, they hold really well and won't pull through your drawer box, and I'll link to the screws in the video description. I repeated the process on the rest of the drawers, and after adding the screws, I could then remove those temporary screws from the drawer fronts. Finally, I could drill holes through the drawer box, and now I had perfectly aligned drawer fronts ready for drawer pulls with no extra marks to clean up from brad nails, plus I didn't have to deal with hot glue or double-sided tape. And I went ahead and added a drawer pull just to make sure everything looked good, and it did, so I repeated the whole process on the other side of the workbench, this time with my plain drawer fronts. Next, I could prep for the second coat of clear on the top and the first coat on the drawer fronts by sanding the top with 220 grit, knocking down any weirdness from that first coat. I vacuumed off all the dust on the top as well as the dust in the drawer boxes from all that drilling, and then it was time for round 2 of finishing, which went much more smoothly, thankfully. And I actually thinned the halcyon about 30% this time around, and also set up a raking light so it was a little easier to see how the finish was going on, and the second coat was a breeze compared to the first coat. With that, I left the finish to dry for a few hours, got all those drawer pulls installed, and then I could get my T-Track installed. So I used Rockler's Universal T-Track along with their T-Track intersections, and I started by getting the intersections installed. I first got the pieces aligned how I wanted them, and then used a self-centering drill bit to pre-drill the holes. I added some screws to secure the pieces in place. I repeated the process at the next intersection in line, and then I could get a section of T-Track cut to length to fit between the intersections. And it ended up working out that a 3-foot length of T-track would cover these 2 sections at each corner with almost no waste, so I worked on getting those 2 sections installed first. Also, I hadn't originally planned on using these intersections, and since I only had 2 of them on hand, I had to install and then uninstall each intersection just to get the T-track installed, since the extras I had ordered hadn't quite arrived yet. From there, I just worked my way around the workbench installing more T-track, and since these T-track pieces are aluminum, they cut easily with a standard miter saw blade, and I just took my time sneaking up on the fit so I didn't end up with huge gaps. And unfortunately, I ended up 1 section short, so I'll have to fill that in a little later. But I also wanted to show what I did at the intersections in the center of the workbench, since this was a little different. So instead of using those Rockler intersections or butting the pieces tight to each other, I intentionally left a gap here. And this gap allows me to add and remove T-track accessories from the middle of the workbench. And this is really handy if your workbench is covered with a bunch of tools and parts, since otherwise you'd have to move everything out of the way to slide the accessory all the way from the center of the workbench to the edge, which is how I have my T-track set up on my other assembly table. So with that, I think I can officially call this workbench done, and I could not be more excited with how it turned out. Again, I have plans available for the workbench in case you're interested, and I'll link to those in the video description below. If it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss my future woodworking videos, and I'll link to all the tools and materials I used on this project in the video description below. Thanks again for watching, and until next week, happy building.